So this is our developer office hours, and we have a whole slew of experts to help you with your .NET questions today. And we'll also take other questions on other languages or other OAuth related items. So I'd like to start by just going around the room. And I do have to make you aware that Heather Downing unfortunately lost her voice. And so Lee will be introducing her. And we'll start just in the order that I see it on the screen. So Laura, would you like to start off introducing yourself and what you do at Okta?
Of course. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura. I have been working on the developer experience team for almost 2 years now, building different SDKs for the .NET community, such as the ASP.NET SDK, also the management SDKs, among others. Open for your questions.
Great. Thank you. And Aaron Parecki?
Yeah, hi, I'm Aaron. I work on the developer advocacy team here. I do mostly stuff around OAuth. I teach people about OAuth OpenD Connect and do workshops for our customers and talks at conferences. So happy to talk about all things OAuth with you all today.
All right. And finally, Lee.
My name's Lee Brandt. I'm a developer advocate at Okta. I specialize in .NET and JavaScript, so that's why I'm here. I'd be happy to answer any questions about .NET, and I think I'm going to introduce Heather because she can't speak. So Heather also lives in Kansas City with me, which I'm totally grateful to have such an awesome developer in Kansas City. She does a lot around C# and .NET. She also does a lot around voice. So if you have any questions about Alexa or the like for authentication, she'd be happy to send me the answers to that so I can tell you. And she's been developing for many, many years and speaking all over the world. I think this is her first time back in Kansas City in the last 3 months. So welcome back to Kansas City, and welcome everybody to the developer office hours.
All right. So my name is Matt Rabel. I live in Denver, Colorado, so I'm kind of close to Lee. I like the Broncos more than the Chiefs, but it seems to be their year, not ours. So just to let you know how it works is if you're watching this on YouTube or you're in the Zoom on YouTube, you can put your questions in comments and we'll see those. And if you're actually in Zoom, then there's a Q&A or a chat that you can use and we'll see your questions there. And so we'll start off with a question that we have here. Maybe Lee can take this one. How do I add custom user roles and role-based authorization to ASP.NET?
Okay, so this is gonna, actually I just finished doing this for .NET Core 3.0, but it's gonna depend on which version of .NET you're using, whether you're using .NET Framework or .NET Core. But .NET Core, actually, one of the things that I do a lot is use groups as roles. And so mapping groups to roles can be actually pretty easy in .NET Core 3. In the plain old OIDC middleware, there's a setting where you can pass in the token validation parameters, and you can actually map some claims. And so one of the things that you can do is you can say that the role claim type comes from some key value in the ID token. And so for me, what I do is I always put my groups in a claim called groups. And then in that token validation parameter, I just say that the role claim type is actually called groups, and it just maps them right over for me. For .NET Framework, I haven't found something as good as that yet. Maybe there's something in Owen that I'm not aware of, but I usually just in Owen, in my after they've logged in, I just go ahead and map their group claims over to roles, just so I can use the basic authorization, what do they call them? The authorized decorators over my controller actions. So it's pretty simple in .NET Core, a little bit more involved in .NET Framework.
All right, so the next one I'm going to give to Laura. This one is, if I want to use Okta for identity management in my ASP.NET application, do I have to use the Okta SDK?
Okay, so basically you are asking about the management SDK, right? Or the ASP.NET SDK?
Well, for identity management. So if you're going to do any sort of, authentication, I'm just assuming, right? I'm reading the question here.
Yeah. So basically, yeah, you have like different approaches to add authentication to your ASP.NET application. You can use OpenID Connect and use our ASP.NET SDK, which makes things easier for you to integrate and to configure Okta and OpenID Connect. But also, if you don't use that and you want to use the authentication APIs provided by Okta, you can use our management SDK. So you have two different approaches. If you don't want to use the SDKs or those SDKs because, or you have like any conflict in terms of compatibility or any other concerns, you can still use Okta. And for example, if you want to use the OpenID Connect into your application, you can use the Microsoft OpenID Connect module, and you can still configure Okta without that SDK. So you have like different approaches. You just have to choose the one that fit best with your application.
And I'm guessing if you wanted to actually add like user management or something like that in your ASP.NET application, you could probably, if you didn't want to use Okta SDK for some reason, you could just use REST and talk to the APIs that way with an API
Exactly.
token.
You can do that as well. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, just the SDK makes it easier to just say, hey, get me this user's information. You don't have to actually know what the endpoint is and what parameters need to be passed to it. You can just call it like any other method.
Okay. So this next one might be good for Aaron because I don't think it's .NET specific. Should I be using the refresh token periodically to refresh the token from Okta with a new expiration and to check if the user is logged out of Okta? Or should I be doing that when the original token expires instead of simply ending the session? I'm not confused about how to do it. I'm just wondering if I should be doing it.
So the idea with the refresh token is that if your access tokens do expire, that's how you get a new one. And the access token might expire for a bunch of different reasons. So basically, the thing you should be looking for is if you made an API call and it failed because the access token expired, which is one of the response codes they'll get back from the API, then use the refresh token to get a new one. So that's hopefully a short summary of the recommendation on refresh tokens.
Yeah, and I guess the good question is, and Laura probably knows, does the SDK already handle this for you, or does the OIDC middleware already handle this for you? So if you try and make a call with an expired auth token, does it actually automatically go ahead and use the refresh token and get a new auth token, or do you have to manually do that yourself?
So for our SDKs, we didn't want to handle the session expiration because it's too complex, and we didn't want to be super opinionated on this because there are many ways to do this. So it is up to the developer to handle that. Okta manages the authentication, and then it's up to the developer to handle the session.
Okay, so if I'm like, let's say I'm making a call from an MVC app or something, and I make a call and pass the auth token and it's expired, I'll get something back from Okta that lets me know that the auth token's expired, and it's my responsibility as a developer to make the refresh call with my refresh token, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thanks. See, I learned something today too.
So did I.
Nice, thank you. All right, so now we're on to the next one here, and that is, can I use server-side Blazor with Okta?
Oh, this is Heather's question.
So Heather can't speak, and she's typing right now. So she's been kind enough to answer it here, and I'll read her answer. So she says, for Blazor, there has been a few significant developments in the general release of server-side version that differs from the preview version that Heather previously wrote a blog about. And she's been working with Microsoft directly, and you can expect an updated set of documentation next week for how to configure your Blazor app to work with an external auth provider like Okta. So yes, you can use server-side Blazor with Okta once Heather and Microsoft get some things worked out next week. So be on the lookout for that blog post. All right, so now we have one that's seems to be about OIDC middleware and how do we define the callback route. It says in Okta, when we register the app, the login redirect is signin-OIDC. And when we say that it's handled by the OIDC middleware, it adds those routes to the route table. And is there a link to that documentation? So I don't know who wants to grab this.
I guess the question is, are they talking about Microsoft's OIDC middleware or our OIDC middleware? Or I'm pretty sure our SDK kind of piggybacks on Microsoft's OIDC middleware, if I'm not mistaken. Laura?
Yeah, so for callbacks, URIs, we have a default for the different .NET versions. We use the same just to be consistent. It's not the default that Microsoft is using for 3.0. For example, it's actually authorization -code /callback, something like that. But still, developers still can configure that. So I think we have information about that in our README on the GitHub repo. Otherwise, we can update that in the future to make it more clear. But yeah.
Yeah, and I guess the short answer is yes, the OIDC middleware handles those routes and adds those routes to the route table when you configure the OIDC middleware. That's the short answer. The longer answer, like how it does it and where the documentation is for that, I don't know. I'm looking right now to see the setup for OIDC in like Startup CS, and I don't see anything that explicitly says that it does actually add those to the route table, but it has to, otherwise it wouldn't know where to route it. You would just get a 404.
Okay. So we'll move on to the next one, and I would remind anyone that's watching on YouTube or in the Zoom call to go ahead and ask them. It looks like we have one in Zoom here in the Q&A.
Okay.
Maybe.
Yeah, the question is from Warren Yuen. Hi, I have a question about the proxy configuration or how the proxy configuration works for .NET User Management SDK. Is there an example of what needs to be done? I couldn't find it on the GitHub repo. Setting up the proxy configuration for the SDK. What do you think, Laura?
Yes, that's a good question because it's been a while since I played with that. We do have proxy settings in our configuration object, but I'm not sure if we have any documentation about that. So probably it is something that we will need to add. I need to check that with the team.
So maybe the person who's asking it, Warren here, if you could just enter an issue on the .NET User Management SDK to document that, then we can certainly help you with that. I know I'm more familiar with the Java side of things, and the Java SDK, for Java anyway, it's just a built-in like properties that you can set, or system properties, environment variables, and then that makes it so, you know, the SDK can go through a proxy. So, okay, so I got a question for Aaron here. Why is implicit an option if authorization code flow is better or more secure?
Oh, that's a good question. So this kind of is going to be a bit of a history lesson, but it used to be the case that implicit was the normal flow for all JavaScript apps, actually also for native apps. And over time, a lot of things have changed in the space and in the technology, and we've got better solutions for mobile apps, and now also better solutions for JavaScript apps, which is to do the auth code flow and then using the PKCE extension instead of a secret. And that is now the recommendation from the OAuth group, is to use auth code and PKCE for everything, basically. No longer, we don't need the implicit flow anymore. It doesn't solve anything anymore. It used to solve some problems. It used to be a workaround in a browser environment, and it's no longer needed. There's, I actually did a whole video explaining this, chatted with Nate about this, and we can drop a link to that that video. It's on YouTube. So that goes into a lot more detail on some background on that. So I guess the short answer for why it's an option is because it was historically the only solution for JavaScript apps. And now we are moving to a world where there is a much better solution, auth code and PKCE, and it's still there because not every OAuth server has necessarily updated to this, you know, support the better solution yet. So it's there for mostly backwards compatibility at this point.
Right. And also for Okta specifically, we allow both. And what I gathered from the team is we would like to eventually make PKCE the default. But for our auth JS SDK, which all our Angular and Vue and React SDKs depend upon, that needs a major release, right? We can't just say PKCE is the default in a minor release. So that'll be coming. Can't give you any specific dates, but we will eventually make it so Angular, React, and Vue use PKCE by default. Right now, all you have to do is say PKCE equals true in your configuration. And then on the admin console as well, when you create a new app, it'll default to auth code flow instead of implicit. So it's coming, but right now you just got to check a box, so it's not terribly difficult. All right, so let's get another one here. So I have an MVC ASP.NET framework web app, and I don't understand how to manage roles. I've read that I need to translate groups to roles, but I can't find current documentation that does that. So I believe Lee already answered that when he was talking about ASP.NET and how you can have a groups claim, and then you add that to your authorization server. You usually do that in the default authorization server. And we could even show that if you wanted to do a screen share, or does that?
Yeah, I'm trying to find the, because I just wrote a blog post about this too. And I actually just released a YouTube video about it today. So let's see if I can figure out how to post something to everyone in the chat. Maybe the attendees can let me know if you get that. I posted that from me to everyone, but just a link to a blog post where I talk about that. And also I do have a blog post for 4.x where I actually map. There's a handler as part of the ON framework that you can tap into where you can map groups to roles. And if I can find that, blog post, I will link to it as well. Looks like Warren Yuen had another question in the Zoom chat. With auth code PKCE flow, it looks like the front-end SDKs have an issue with IE11. Is it official that IE11 is not a supported browser of the Okta SDKs? That's a good question.
I remember seeing that issue. I'm looking in the Okta auth.js project right now. I believe they were able to add support for Edge, but I don't think IE11 is supported. And as far as I know, like Microsoft recommended you don't use it for security reasons. So I can't speak to the DevX team, but maybe Laura, do you know about the JS SDKs and the officially supported browsers?
No, we need to ask that to the team. Yeah.
Okay, so I think as a security-minded developer for your companies, It is in your interest to encourage your companies not to support IE11, and then go that way. It's one way to get around.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I was just trying to. I thought I just saw something recently about Internet Explorer 11 not being supported, but it looks like it's going to be supported until the supported for the life of Windows 7, 8, and 10. So it's going to be supported for a while longer still. So I have heard of a lot of problems with IE11 though.
So here's I'll post this in the chat here. Here's an issue that I found about Edge and IE11 and some status on it. So it looks like Edge works fine, and IE11 may be supported. So progress. All right.
I'm not exactly sure why Internet Explorer has always been the redheaded stepchild of browsers, but it just seems like as a web developer since '93, IE has always been the problem child when you're doing anything with JavaScript. So,
well, I remember back in IE4 and IE6 when those came out, they were awesome, right? Because they were like ahead of Netscape at the time.
Yeah, well, everybody was using things like hypertext controls and things like that that weren't supported in any other browser, but you could do it in IE.
We really don't want to restart the browser wars. This is not a good time for that.
Well, and IE Edge really made a step forward when they adopted the Chrome engine. That really helped them out a lot, because now they can just develop features for their browser and they don't have to worry about developing the engine as well. So it's just super smart move by Microsoft.
All right, so I have one here. This seems to be best for Laura. When will an updated .NET SDK compiled against .NET Core 3 come out?
Okay, yeah, so we have many SDKs to port to .NET 3.0. We started already with ASP.NET Core. I submitted a PR last week. We are waiting for the code review now to release a new version. Then we will continue with the management SDK that is already in our backlog, but I can't provide an ETA now, but it is already in our backlog. So stay tuned for updates because we're working on that already.
Yeah, it is important to note that .NET 3.0, 3.0 wasn't widely adopted because it didn't have any long-term support for it. So most of the companies that I was talking to were waiting until 3.1 came out, which was the 3rd of this month, so like 7 days ago. 3.1 came out. It does have long-term support, so now companies are looking to adopt it.
Okay, so in that same vein, how would you add secure authentication to a .NET Core 3.0 or 3.1 app with Okta?
Let me see if I can screen share, since I just did this last night. I pull this out of the way so I can see. Share.
So one answer we're getting from Heather is to just use the APIs directly, right? Instead of actually using an SDK for it.
Okay.
So it's always an option, right? With any language, any framework.
Yeah. So can everybody see my screen okay?
Yep.
Okay. So here I'm just using the basic OIDC middleware. And if all you need to do is just add authentication and authorization, this will work just fine. If you don't need to be able to like manage users or add users to groups or things like that from within your application, this will work just fine. So basically you're going to install a package, Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authentication, and you're going to bring in the cookies and the OpenID Connect package from there. And then the identity model, you're going to bring in OpenID Connect protocol and the tokens. So then go right down to configure services. And in the configure services, you're going to go ahead and add authentication, add cookies, add OpenID Connect, and add authorization. inside the add authentication, there's a couple of options, and these are just enums that just output the word cookies and the word OpenID Connect, so you don't have to remember that it's open capital O, ID capital I, but lowercase d, those sorts of things. So whenever I'm using these defaults, those are all just enums. So I'm going to set the default scheme and the default challenge scheme for the authentication. That just lets it know we're going to use cookies, and we're going to use OpenID as the authentication scheme when we challenge someone. And then in the OpenID Connect options, you set the sign-in scheme again to cookies. That's what we want to use. The authority we're going to get from our configuration, just our Okta domain with whatever. This is actually the URL of my authentication server. I just happen to be using the default authentication server. So it's whatever my Okta domain is, /OAuth2/default. I want to be able to talk over HTTPS, so that's turned on. I want to pass in the client ID and the client secret. Obviously, you're probably not going to want to put these in like app settings or something if you're going to check that code in, but the response type is going to be code because we're using the auth code flow. Again, this is just an enum that says code. We're going to get the claims from the user info endpoint that's available for OIDC stuff. OpenID and profile are going to be the two scopes we're going to ask for. We want to make sure that we save the tokens. And here's what I was talking about in the token validation parameters. I added a couple of new token validation parameters. This is just going to validate the issuer. So when I get a token, make sure that it's from the issuer that I thought it was going to be from. In this case, the name claim type, because Okta sends the name claim type out as lowercase n name, I need to make sure that the name claim type is mapped to name. The role claim type is going to be mapped to groups. This is what allows me to get groups out into roles. And then the last thing I need to do is in configure, I just need to right before use authorization, add use authentication, so that I have use authentication and use authorization in there. Then when I need to use authorization, all I've got to do is add my regular authorize and make sure that my roles are whatever the roles are. Obviously, I'm not in the dancer's role, but yeah, that's as easy as it gets. It's just a couple of lines of configuration in your startup CS, and then you use it.
All right. So hopefully that answered that person's question. We have a question in the Q&A on Zoom. It says, with Xcode update from 10.2 to 11.2, my native application, 330, using Okta auth Swift is no longer working with an error, API error. And then the question, is there any incompatibility with the new Xcode release? So I don't know if we have anyone on the call that actually works on that project, but I did recently do something with our React Native API or SDK, and that uses Okta OIDC under the covers for both Swift and for Android. And I'm using Xcode 11.2.1, and it worked fine for me. So I don't think there's an issue. I have had some people report that my tutorial they couldn't get it to work with Android, but I have a screencast that shows it does work. So maybe the best thing would be to do is to enter a GitHub issue on that GitHub project and note it there. And then the developers that worked on that SDK will be able to help you out. And Heather says she's doing an iOS blog post next year. So worst case, it'll be in your New Year's Eve gift.
Yeah, sorry, we don't know much more about iOS and Xcode, anonymous attendee.
Right. I think, for anyone on the call, like if you actually encounter issues with any of our SDKs, the first thing would be just, post a casual question on our developer forums. That's devforums.okta.com. And if it doesn't get answered, I would say in, 24, 48 hours, and go ahead and just post an issue in the actual GitHub project. And the developers that work on those will be notified. All right, so I have another one here that says, I have code based on the sample under samples ASP.NET Core, the Okta hosted login. So that's where Okta actually has the login screen on our site. I would like to add custom claims to the claims principal and have them persisted in the auth cookie. Is there an event hook in the authentication process where I can do this? So who's most experienced with event hooks?
I can answer that.
Okay.
In our ASP.NET SDK, we provide 2 different hooks. So you can, I think one is after token validated and the other one after user information received. So you can hook on these events and write your own code to add like custom claims to the principal. Yeah, you can do that now with the ASP.NET SDK.
Okay. So we have a question here from YouTube. Is OIDC still stateful like session cookies? Do I still have to have a session store on the server? I'm not clear how to do stateless REST auth on the web, but thought OIDC was the answer. Who wants to take that one?
Oh, that's definitely an Aaron question.
So is OIDC the answer for stateless REST authentication?
So OpenID Connect is going to give you information about the user, and you can you could use the OIDC ID token as the sort of session identifier to make a totally stateless thing. You end up going through some hoops to make that work well, and chances are you're going to want to probably store other things statefully, or at least application-specific things as well. So it usually ends up being better to just go ahead and create a session for your app. There are options for your app to do stateless to avoid storing stuff on the server. You can use like cookies where you can encode data into them so that you can actually avoid storing stuff on your server, but still be able to store stuff in a session for that user. I don't know the .NET specific term for that, but Lee, maybe do you know how to do that? .NET, like encoding data in a cookie so that you don't have to store stuff on the server.
I mean, we used to do it a lot with session state back in the day. Session state was just a variable that you'd pass back and forth. But understand that the question itself, REST by itself, if you read the original REST specification, which I did, and if you're an insomniac who doesn't respond to strong drugs, I highly recommend reading it. But one of the things that it talks about is the kind of drawback of REST in and of itself is the fact that it's chatty. So generally what you would probably do is for stateless REST stuff is you'd probably send the token back and then validate the token with whatever your identity provider is in your API. So there's going to be some chatting going on with, okay, I've got a call that came in, here's their auth credentials, I need to verify that with the ID provider. And this is something that we talk about quite a bit, is you can validate a token right there without having to make a call to the identity provider, but it's much more secure if you actually make the call to the identity provider to make sure that that token hasn't been revoked or whatever. So,
and also, just to be clear on that, that's talking about the access token, not OpenID Connect. That's an access token coming in with the REST call, because your clients are not going to be sending ID tokens up in a REST API call. They're going to be sending the access token. Yeah,
and OIDC really is, if I'm not mistaken, is really the part that deals with the authenticating of the user, and the OAuth 2 piece is the piece that deals with the authorization of the user. Correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we're talking about using it stateless, having a stateless session on a REST API, then really the way to have a stateless session is the identity provider knows that it's given out that token, and you can verify that token with the identity provider. That way your server doesn't have to solve anything or save anything. But still, some server somewhere has got a session token, an auth token that's given out.
All right.
I hope that makes sense for the YouTube viewer.
And if it doesn't, ask another question, or a clarifying question on YouTube. We'll do our best. There's a little bit of chat going on in just a channel between the team here, and it looks like Laura has a follow-up on why do you have to use implicit, right, with ASP.NET?
Yeah, we were talking about in ASP.NET 4.x, with our SDK, you had to have auth code flow turned on as well as the implicit flow turned on. And it looks like that's no longer the case. It was a limitation of Katana. I don't know if Laura wants to speak more to what was going on with that.
Okay.
Yeah, no, our SDK currently does not support that yet. But definitely, if you want to use the code flow, you can use the OIDC middleware directly. So yeah, we will need to add support for that.
Okay, so follow-up question from YouTube is, I believe this is talking about the statefulness or stateless. Is it even an issue in your opinion? I don't get the impression that statelessness is super important in web app development. Then is statefulness the standard? So that's, I can try with this just a little bit on my experience, and that is that I do hear a lot of people saying they need to be stateless to scale. And I do hear a lot of people saying that they need stateful to be more secure. So what I've seen is a lot of people complaining, at least in the Java world, about how sessions are handled and about the scalability of sessions, especially when you have 20 or 30 servers. How do you sync that session across the servers? And one popular thing that's happened in our community is that Redis has become a way for you to store your session. And so instead of relying on your app server that's like Tomcat or something like that to store your session, you distribute it through Redis. And there's a way, at least with Spring, to actually, replace the actual session store, and the end developer knows nothing about it. So I do plan to do a blog post next year that compares stateless versus stateful versus like OIDC, and actually doing a performance comparison between them all, and maybe get some more light on the subject, because I do believe that there's a lot of developers out there that think they need to be stateless, but maybe they don't. They've never really proven that stateless really needs to happen. They just read the architecture docs and think they need to.
And I think that's a good point. It really depends on your architecture. The question here is, like, he doesn't get the impression that statelessness is super important. And it may not be for your app. It just depends on your application's architecture. If you have one server serving your web app to all the users, then statelessness is not a problem, because they're all going to the same server. But once you start scaling out to multiple servers being round robin in the background, then you have a new challenge, like Matt said, of who's going to keep track of all these sessions, because the first request that came in went to server 3, and the next request that came in with their session token went to server 5, and that server doesn't know what your session token is or how to get it. So, yeah.
Right, and the beauty is, one of the things about OIDC in general, and OAuth, is that you're getting the OAuth token from Okta in most cases, and then if you're backend, say you have microservices environment, you have 20 different services, those should just be validating that that's an actual, valid authentication token or access token, and going on from there. So as far as they handle that, there might be some session storage in your microservice, so they don't have to validate it every time, but it's probably not a bad idea to validate it every time. So we have another question here about, can you customize the CSS for the Okta login? Anyone want to take this, or I can grab it?
Yeah, I was looking to see if I could find that page that talks about the things that you can customize.
So if you go to developer.okta.com and scroll down, I believe there's actually a demo
there's
right there.
Widget there. Okay, and the CSS, does that still pertain to the Okta hosted login page, or just the widget?
Well, so the widget has two ways, right? You can either host it on Okta, or you can have it locally. And if you were to do it locally, then you would embed the widget, and then you would go ahead and customize the CSS to override what the sign-in widget has.
Okay.
But if you're doing hosted login, then there's possible to do it there as well. From what I understand, it works best if you have a custom domain. But typically you'll go ahead and I believe it's under, I can share my screen here. I can figure it out. Meeting, start sharing. I gotta give Zoom access. Those might take a while. If anyone else is faster, go for it. I gotta quit Zoom to share because of permissions on my OS, so I won't do that. But if you, let me just log in and I'll walk you through it. So if whoever asked that question wants to log their developer org.
Yeah, on developer.okta.com, where you were talking about, I think one of the good things to start with would be looking at the CSS and looking at the IDs and the classes that they're using there, because I'm pretty sure you can override anything that's there. Those are just the CSS classes and IDs that it's using. So that's probably the best place to start.
And if you log into your Okta org and go to customization sign-in page, you can actually customize all of the HTML and CSS there. It looks like you do need a custom domain to set up that widget. And right now, we do require you to upload an SSL certificate, but we are working on integrating with, what is it? Let's Encrypt eventually, so we can automate all of that for you.
Yeah.
So,
and you're going to need the SSL cert, because basically we're going to be serving you your style sheet when we serve up the hosted login page, and it needs to be served with your domain's certificate or whatever.
Right, and I believe there's even maybe a requirement in OAuth that requires HTTPS. Is that correct, Aaron? Or no?
Pretty much everything in OAuth needs HTTPS.
It does need it?
Yeah, there's no way to do it without HTTPS.
Okay, so that's why we
securely
require.
Anyway.
Yep. All right, so another question we have here is, how do you recommend managing secrets, like a client secret in .NET?
Okay, I was trying to find that blog post. There's actually a blog post about how to use key management servers. That's probably the most secure way to handle secure values that you need to use in your app. You can use them with as like environment variables, but the most secure way is to use a key management server. Azure has one called Key Vault. AWS has one that I think is just called Key Management Server. So all it does is it stores the secret for you, and you get a cert that when you go to call something, you use that cert and it just injects that value back out to you. So it's basically like a server storing it for you.
Okay.
I'm trying to find that blog post about Key Vault. We have an example out there app. There it is. I'll go ahead and post this in the chat as well about how to use Azure Key Vault to store your secrets.
I think it looks like you sent it to me privately.
Oh.
From Lee to me.
All panelists and attendees.
So I have another one here that I believe has already been answered, but let me ask it anyway. It seems that as if the Okta libraries for OWIN/.NET don't have any provision for checking managing session expiration due to inactivity and/or Okta refresh tokens. Shouldn't the code provided by Okta handle that? And didn't, Laura, you say that we don't do that, or the SDK does not do that? Okay.
Exactly. Yeah, we don't do that.
And the reason is because people do it all kinds of different ways, so we want to allow that flexibility?
Yeah, it is a complex scenario, and we let the developer to decide how to handle that. That's why we don't want to be super opinionated on that, and we don't handle that in any of our SDKs.
Okay. So we have a question here from Warren again. Thanks for all your questions, Warren. I noticed that a lot of the SDKs have custom login and browser sign-in examples, which is great. Are there any plans to add support for social login or authentication with external providers, OIDC, in the custom login samples? Do you want to take that one, Laura, since you work on those samples?
Yes, can you repeat the question, Matt?
So it's asking if we plan on adding support for social login or authentication with external identity providers.
Yes, we do support that, login with external identity providers. Actually, there are some samples on our repos. We provided an example to login with Facebook and also Google. And yes, you can find those samples on our samples repo.
So there's already those existing, but you do have to create like a Facebook app, right, to make it work?
Right.
Like that.
Yes. First, you have to create like an account in the Facebook developer site, and then you have to configure that in your Okta dashboard, and then you can use our samples. Yeah, you need some configuration before that.
And I believe we have generic OAuth support, so that should cover the external identity providers. And then, but that is using the browser sign-in flow. Yeah, I mean, social login is going to use the browser sign-in flow, right? It's going to redirect to Facebook and then come back.
Yes, exactly. Right. Yeah.
So if you're looking for something else, Warren, please go ahead and say what your use case is and what you're looking for there. In the meantime, I'll move on to another question over here. Question is, how does the resource server handle authenticating requests from the client application after the authorization server has generated it? You want to take that one, Aaron?
I can take this one. So normally this is handled by some sort of middleware in your framework, but what's actually happening under the hood is the access token comes in and then the resource server has to say, hey, is this thing valid? The way it can do that is either by going and back out to send it over to Okta and say like, hey, is this token valid? And you get back a response. Or because if you're using Okta, our access tokens are JSON Web Tokens, you can actually go and do that JSON Web Token validation of checking the signature and all that stuff to check whether the token is valid. That'll then tell you stuff about the token, like who the user it was issued for and what are the scopes issued to it. And that it can all be used to determine whether or not you should process that API request. And like I said, normally it's handled by a middleware library, which will do a lot of that stuff for you. But that's you can also do it manually. It's not too difficult.
Okay. So another one we have here, and this is on service workers. So if anyone's not familiar with service workers, they're basically a background thread in your browser that allows you to do offline applications. It's kind of like a proxy in your browser. So it can do caching of requests. And this one says any solutions when service workers have queued up requests and say the app's in offline mode and an access token's expired. So how to get service worker to get a refresh token with implicit grant. And then related is Microsoft AAD, which I assume is Azure Active Directory, does not support code auth flow with SPA clients. Sad face.
Yeah, this is a fun one. So the implicit grant, goes back to the origins of OAuth. It was always known that it was not a secure grant. And because of that, there has never been a mechanism to get a refresh token if an app has used the implicit grant. So that is just not an option. If you're using the implicit grant, you cannot get a refresh token to refresh the token. The only option is to do the actual implicit grant again, which requires that the user is in a browser and that browser redirect happens. There are some options for doing that sort of transparently where you can like put it in a hidden iframe so it's not visible, but it does require that the user is in a browser and does that redirect step. So if you have used the implicit grant to go get an access token, your only option is to do the same grant again to get a new access token. Now, it is unfortunate that Microsoft doesn't support auth code flow with single page app clients yet. I'm sure that will change in the near future. They have been part of the discussions in the OAuth group about deprecating the implicit flow and supporting PKCE for JavaScript apps. So I have no idea when it's going to come, but I'm sure it's coming. And that's really how you want to do it for service workers, where, yeah, if you want the service worker to be able to go and get new access token itself, it doesn't have a browser environment accessible to it. So it needs to have a refresh token to be able to go get a new access token.
So if you're using auth code flow with PKCE, then you can get a refresh token, correct?
That depends on the authorization server. So technically, yes, it is possible that your authorization server might let a JavaScript app get a refresh token using auth code and PKCE. It is a policy decision at the authorization server. So it depends on how the authorization server is configured and also whether or not it even supports it in the first place.
Okay, and so if your authorization server supports implicit flow with the refresh token, then it's not OAuth
That's not
compliant?
a thing. Yeah, that's not a thing. There is no such thing as implicit flow with refresh token.
Okay.
If anybody has built that, unbuild it, please.
Right. Stop using that authorization server.
Yeah.
All right. So the only other one that I have here is how do I implement OIDC to ASP.NET Core? But I think, Lee, you already answered that with your code demo, right?
Yep.
So.
And to be clear, our SDK actually builds on that OIDC middleware, and it just allows you to do it just a little bit easier. But the SDK makes things like user management, like I want to add a user, or I want to lock a user out, or I want to move a user to a group or add a new group. All those kinds of things are drop dead simple with the SDK and are you're much better off using the SDK than trying to make the API calls yourself. Just don't do that to yourself.
Okay, so the last question I see, and we could obviously get more. So if you have more questions, please enter them in Zoom or enter them on YouTube. But this one is about moving Okta users between orgs. Has anyone had any experience with this? If they have one org and they want to move to another, or maybe it's a parent-child relationship in a company where they want to move, some users from one company up to the parent company. Is there anyone that has experience with this? So we're getting some no's. That's fine. I think there's our engineering team does have a tool that could do that for you. And so it's possible that you could reach out to developers at okta.com and they could help you there. The other thing is you could also use our APIs and SDKs to actually do that manually in a sense. You would pull from one org and put it into another org. And you could also do it real time if you wanted. You could add some custom logic that says, hey, when they log into this org, make sure and put them up in this org. So it's obviously possible. It just might either take you a little bit of work, or you might have to contact our support and have them do the work for you. So we had another question come in here. Can you share auth servers between different .NET application versions like .NET 4 versus .NET Core, or do they need their own server? So this is our authorization servers.
I would imagine you can if you're using the OIDC middleware. It's just OIDC. It doesn't make any difference whether you're talking from .NET Framework or .NET Core.
Right, and I think you could even use the same authorization server for your PHP or Java or even Node.js apps, right? You can have those all registered with the same auth server, and there's nothing really different from an OAuth perspective between them.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I think I have 6 apps right now that are all using the same authorization server. We just set up different apps in Okta that let me know that for my Angular app, it's using implicit flow with PKCE, and with my ASP.NET MVC app, it's using auth code flow. So
you can't use implicit flow with PKCE.
Well, implicit flow with PKCE, sorry.
Without PKCE. And it's funny, I actually was saying for the longest time that PKCE stood for public key code exchange, but I had to delete part of a video out where it's actually proof key, right, for code
exchange, yeah.
And maybe, for those unfamiliar with it, because it might be a new term, if you could just explain, like in a minute or so, Aaron, what PKCE is and how it works.
Yeah, so basically the problem with public clients, which is what a JavaScript app or a mobile app is The problem with those is that you can't use a client secret with them, because if you put a client secret into your JavaScript app, it'll become public and it's no longer a secret. So we can't use a secret. So if you wanted to do the auth code flow, it normally requires a secret. Basically what PKCE does is it, instead of provisioning a secret ahead of time, PKCE is a way that where the app creates a new secret every time, every request. Every time it starts the flow, it makes up a new secret and it uses that in the flow to go and get the access token. So it's a way to avoid registering secrets and having to go and put them into your config file as a client secret. Instead, it just makes it up every time.
And then does the server store that secret?
Only for, it's tied to the request. So it's for the one specific authentication flow. So the user clicks login, the app generates a new secret there, and it's only then used to go get the access token, and then it's forgotten by everything involved. So it's very short-lived.
But if you're doing the browser flow, like it comes back with a code, right? And then it sends the code back again. So the server is storing it for a second or two.
Yeah, exactly.
Like
so the server, it's basically a one-time use secret. So the server needs to store it just as long as the authorization code is valid, which is usually like 60 seconds or maybe 5 minutes. And that's the maximum amount of time that the server would have to store that secret. And then as soon as it's used to get the access token, it's discarded.
Cool. So use PKCE with auth code flow if you can. Chances are that if you're using Implicit, you're using like any of the JavaScript SDKs out there. Vue, Angular, React are the most popular ones. But all of our SDKs, all of our JS SDKs support PKCE, and all of our blog posts going forward will likely use that over Implicit. And Aaron sits on the committee that helps define what PKCE is and how all that works, and trying to get people to stop using implicit flow. So good stuff. So I think we're about done here. We only have 4 minutes left. So if there's another question that rolls in, we'll try to answer it. But in the meantime, I would encourage you, it's devforum.okta.com is where you can ask teams question on this team or our developer support team or a whole bunch of folks, questions about Okta and how it works with our APIs. You can also hit a lot of us up on Twitter. We all have Twitter accounts. You can just Google our names and probably find us. And otherwise, keep using Okta and let us know when you're having issues with it, and we'll do our best to help you. So thanks for coming.